I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and this is the New York Times Close Up. Journalist David Margolick joins us to talk about his new book, When Caesar Was King. It's about how Sid Caesar's groundbreaking live sketches pioneered the smart, fast-paced comedy that made shows like Saturday Night Live and 30 Rock possible. But first, Minneapolis, still reeling from the killing of Alex Freddie and Renee Good. The nation is now roiled by debate over how far ICE can go and how states can push back. We're joined by David Chen, who's been covering the new wave of state bills taking aim at federal immigration enforcement. Welcome, David. You've been covering this for the New York Times. You cover state legislatures for the Times and how they're reacting to the federal government. What are they doing and how far can they push back in Albany and other state capitals?
Among the things that they are thinking about now include trying to figure out a way to hold individual ICE agents accountable for their actions. And they're working with both progressive and libertarian groups actually to try to make the argument that the conduct in their mind is so egregious that it does count as something unlawful. It's still a big hurdle to overcome because federal officials generally have broader immunity. But there certainly a lot of the lawyers who are advising some of these legislators, feel that they have some momentum. And so you can look at any number of states, New York being one, Colorado, Washington State, California, that are beginning to push for these kinds of things. So that's just one example.
David, doesn't federal law, federal government have supremacy over the states in most of these cases?
Absolutely. There's that Supremacy Clause, which a bunch of different legal scholars have explained to me and point out, and so that has long been sort of the barrier, I guess. But there are a couple of different cases in history, and there are other things where some of these, again, lawyers feel like they can potentially thread the needle in trying to do something on a few of these accountability measures. I think what's probably a little more realistic, though maybe not necessarily as wide-ranging, would be some potential fiscal issues or bills that are also popping up. New York has a bill, introduced a bill last year, a couple of legislators, to try to limit or kind of get rid of fuel tax exemptions for any airlines that were in the business of transporting detainees. I think it was dubbed the Avello Airlines bill in some places because that carrier had been involved. Delaware, I think, has introduced a similar bill in a few other places. There's also a bill that's been floating around to try to introduce or to try to impose liens on any federal buildings, that might be used for whether it's staging operations or other things related to it. So those are a couple of the other tools that are being discussed by legislators in New York and elsewhere.
David, is this only happening in Democratic-controlled states? And if it is, doesn't it make the Democrats look weak on immigration enforcement?
It's a great question. Certainly a number of proposals have been made in purple or even red states. Whether those kinds of ideas actually come to fruition remains to be seen. Could even be described as a long shot. But you take a place like like Colorado, which can be purple, has kind of this interesting libertarian Democratic governor for now. And they're working with some libertarian groups in trying to make the argument that federal overreach of any flavor is something that folks should be concerned about. They're looking at what happened in Ruby Ridge back in the 90s. They're looking at what happened in in Idaho with the Bundys in terms of just sieges. And I think that there's some some resonance there for some conservative or libertarian folks. So we'll see. And then in terms of just being perceived as weak on immigration, that is always an argument. That is something that the White House told me about. Others have said in terms of that is any kind of attempt to water things down, would indicate sort of an unwillingness to go after, or to thwart their immigration policies.
Are we beginning to hear any Republicans, whether in Congress or in state capitals, join in this backlash against what ICE has done in Minneapolis and other places?
In fact, that has begun to change a little bit in recent days, especially with the killing of Alex Preddy. More Republicans have been sort of raising questions about sort of tactics, and you've got a number of different folks in Congress who've said that. You've had, I would say, one of the earliest and most vocal would have been Phil Scott, the governor of Vermont. Even Kevin Stitt, the governor of Oklahoma, was raising questions over the weekend about sort of the tactics, and he asked what the end game is to all of this. And that is something that is, I think, being replicated, being repeated in a lot of Republican circles, because I think the fact that they could kind of see things, and then to have the administration initially insist that you can't believe what you see, was something that was just a little too far, went too far for some Republicans, at least on that level. So in terms of whether that translates into legislation or other laws, that is another hurdle to surmount.
It's a long time between now and November. It's been a long 1 year of the new Trump administration. But do we have any senses to how immigration will play in the midterms? I
think it's probably an eternity, I would say, in terms of whether that issue resonates in the same way in 10 months. I mean, things could change literally over the weekend or in the next couple of weeks in terms of what ICE does and whether Kristi Noem keeps her job. I mean, all sorts of different things that are sort of beyond prediction at this point. I will say that it does seem that when it comes to, say, redistricting, which has been a really big battle in the states as pushed by Trump, that may also unfold in unpredictable ways. Texas, of course, led off in terms of taking the cue from the president to try to do these very unusual mid-cycle redistricting. New York has thought about it, and now there's some interest in that. But some of those districts that, say, in Texas are slated to be redistricted in favor of Republicans may not necessarily go their way, because they are in areas that are heavily Hispanic, and a lot of the folks there are disillusioned, have been telling reporters and have been polled in terms of having some second thoughts about immigration. So it is likely to be an issue. Whether that is enough to still be the case 10 months from now and is enough to be a pivotal factor in flipping things, that remains to be seen. So the words today: backlash and backfire, perhaps. David Chen of the New York Times, thank you for joining us. Thank you. And coming up next, David Margolick, formerly of the New York Times, his new book, When Sid Caesar Was King. Sid Caesar was doing the kind of sharp, character-driven, writer's room comedy we now take for granted in shows like Saturday Night Live, 30 Rock, and Key and Peele, only he was doing it live for 90 minutes. His sketches, recurring characters, and young writer's room helped set the template for modern comedy. David Margolick is a veteran New York Times journalist and author whose new book is When Caesar Was King: How Sid Caesar Reinvented American Comedy. David, you were interviewing the 2,000-year-old man, a definite sage about comedy, for your book, and you were told by Mel Brooks that people are going to say, gee, this is a really good and really interesting book, a really interesting subject. Just one question, David. Who is Sid Caesar? Well, who is he? Who was he?
Well, Sid Caesar was really the person who invented television comedy. He was the man that came on, the first comedian really to create a comedy that was appropriate to television and unique to television and not warmed over from vaudeville or the movies or radio. Somebody who crafted a more intimate sort of comedy that was suitable to the small screen. The first true comic creation of television. The first person who sort of put together sketch comedy on television and devised this whole new version of comedy that no one had really ever seen before. The first comedian people came to know exclusively through television rather than through something else from before.
One of the things you say in the book is that the only character he could not play was himself, for a simple reason. And as Carl Reiner put it, he didn't know who Sid Caesar was. How come?
Well, no one really knew who Sid Caesar was, including Sid Caesar. He was a very peculiar guy and very hard to read and sort of maladjusted, like a lot of comedians, but maybe in a more extreme way. He was somebody who didn't really mix with people very much, who was very private, who even as a child took a while to learn to speak and withdrew.
He didn't speak till he was 3?
He didn't speak until he was 3, and a lot of his comedy involved stuff other than speech. I mean, he was doing pantomime and he was doing double talk, which is
a great mimic.
A great mimic of languages, and somebody who was sort of a student of human nature and stepping back and watching everybody else. So he was just somebody. I mean, Carl Reiner said, we used to sit around, and these were people like Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks, who had worked with him for a decade. And they said we would sit around and discuss him and trying to figure out what made him tick. And so when he was on TV, the hardest part of any performance for him was introducing the show and introducing acts. I mean, he just couldn't do it. And he would stammer and, and botch his lines, and then he would run off the stage. And I say in the book that he would run off to become someone else, to become one of the characters that he was going to play.
So what made him so funny? Why did he become a funny man, a comedian? You said he could have been a salesman or a lawyer or whatever.
Well, he could have been really a musician. I mean, that was the first thing.
Playing the saxophone.
He played the saxophone, and that was
which was accidental.
Which was accidental because his parents had a boarding house upstairs from the restaurant in Yonkers where he worked and where he'd grown up in Yonkers, and one of the boarders left a saxophone behind. And he took to that because in a way it was another way to distance himself from people. And he fell into that, and he
wouldn't have to talk if he was playing it.
If he was playing the saxophone. And I say that there's one sketch that he did where he's playing with Benny Goodman on his show, not on Your Show of Shows, but on Caesar's Hour, the successor show. And I don't think that I've ever seen him. I watched all of the sketches, as many of them as exist. Most of them exist, and I spent a long time going through them all because people hadn't seen them, most of them, for many, many years. And of them all, the episode where he's actually playing with Benny Goodman's band, you never see him looking as contented and as at home as in that sketch.
Was he still funny today?
He stopped to be, well, I mean, Sid Caesar stopped being funny in 1960. I mean, he wasn't funny ever at all after that in anything new that he did. But the sketches that he did live on and are still incredibly funny. When he was on, and you asked the question about what made him funny, part of what made him funny was his sense for humanity and his ability to sort of pick out what the eternal things that made people funny. He was also funny because he was insightful enough to have funny people writing for him. He had the best writers of his generation writing for him. At one point in his writer's room, and the famous Caesar's writer's room was not on Your Show of Shows, but on Caesar's Hour, at one point he had Larry Gelbart, Neil Simon, and Mel Brooks all writing for him at the same time. I mean, it's hard not to be funny when you have people like that behind you.
How do you separate the writers from the comedian himself? If I had writers like that, would I be funny?
Well, I think
You
that...
you can be frank.
Yeah, well, I think that some comedians were dependent entirely on their writers. Sid was not somebody who did one-liners. I think it was Joe Stein, who was one of his writers and later went on to write Fiddler on the Roof, who said, "I never heard Sid Caesar crack a joke." So that was not his style of humor. So you're funny if you have good writers, but as Mel Brooks said, it didn't matter what you gave Sid Caesar, he would elevate it to another level. He made us all look good. So they made him look good, but he made them look even better.
Would he be funny today? Would Sid Caesar be a success today?
I think that if Sid were at his top form, and Sid was only in top form for about 10 years, he was sort of done in by alcohol and done in by pills and done in by the changing style of television.
Done in by Lawrence Welk.
And done in by Lawrence Welk because the television audience changed. And initially when Sid was on, television was a Northeastern phenomenon, an urban phenomenon, and the audience was very sophisticated. And then it spread as by capillary action into the hinterlands and to audiences that didn't really get Sid Caesar. Lawrence Welk was much more accessible to them. And you have this incredible, the kind of thing that we writers, couldn't possibly have scripted ourselves, where Sid was actually up against Lawrence Welk in the final season of his final show. And Welk just, beat the hell out of him in the ratings. I mean, the television audience was changing. So if Sid were in top form and Sid had the same kind of writers behind him, I'm sure he could still make it today. But the television audience is segmented, and the sophisticated audience that was on in Sid's early days is off in a corner now on cable. But he would have found his niche, and he could still be funny.
A lot of people suggested that he do movies, go to Hollywood. Why didn't he ever do that?
He was too brittle to do it, and he was too spent to do it. He was burned out. I mean, Mel Brooks encouraged him to do it and said, let's get out of here. Let's go to Hollywood. Television is impermanent. Television is is made on cellophane. It's not going to last. And if you get to Hollywood and you get on film and you can be Harold Lloyd and you can be Buster Keaton and you can be Laurel and Hardy, you'll last forever. But Sid was too tied into television. He was making $25,000 a week in 1954 dollars, $300,000 or $400,000 a week. That's how successful he was. That's how indispensable he was to NBC. And he was too tied down to go to Hollywood. And by the time he needed Hollywood, he was too burned out. I mean, Mel says that you could watch Sid Caesar from week to week, and you could see the brain cells sort of deteriorating. He was being eaten alive. 90 minutes a week on live television, no room to screw up at all. The pressures of coming up with stuff week after week after week, it just used him up. So there was no Sid Caesar left for Hollywood.
Did they ever screw up on live TV?
It's really astonishing that there are no epic screw-ups at all. I mean, Sid was incredibly disciplined. The show, and he had incredibly high standards. The show was scripted. It was very rarely improvised. There are sketches like the most famous Caesar sketch of all, the takeoff of This Is Your Life. And there was a lot of improvisation in that because Your Show of Shows was about to go off the air, and I think they felt freer to improvise. but there was very, very little of that, and the depiction, the popular image of your show of shows and Caesar's Hour from movies like My Favorite Year are incredibly unfair to Caesar and the operation that he had, because there was never anything, never any epic screw-ups. They pulled it off week after week, a feat that somebody compared to walking on a tightrope over Niagara Falls week after week before 20 or 25 million people, and never any epic screw-ups at all.
When Caesar Was King has gotten great reviews, a great one from David Denby in The New Yorker, who described you as a terrific cultural critic. But why should we care about Sid Caesar today?
Well, first, because it's just a great story. I mean, the story about his rise and how it reflects early television and the evolving standards of television and the culture of television, and how this boy from Yonkers came out and influenced television going forward is really a good story, and how it spawned all of these people like Neil Simon and Carol Burnett and Billy Crystal, and all of Sid Caesar's progeny defined what television comedy would be like over the next many decades. And so it's a good story from that angle for sure. And also just the rise and fall of an individual, because he was not only television's first great comic creation, but he was really the first casualty of television. Television ate him alive.
Why are so many comics, or were they, depressed, in therapy, and Jewish?
Well, I'm not sure that I can answer that. It's either somehow baked into the Jewish cultural DNA, or it's a function of Jewish history. It mystifies me, but there's something distinctive about the Jewish experience on this planet.
And why is so much about food?
Well, that was one of the epic things in trying to define what it was that made Caesar's comedy Jewish. And it's the kind of thing that Jews watching it would instantly pick up, but it's very hard for a writer to describe. One of the elements is that there's this fixation with food on the show. And it was a question that I actually asked one of our former colleagues, Mimi Sheridan. And I said, food is central to every culture. Why is it that on Caesar's show, so many of the great sketches, there's a wonderful sketch in a boardroom where Howard Morris, Caesar's co-star, is waving a pickle under Caesar's nose, something that got past the censors. There's another great sketch about Caesar being taken by Imogene Coca, whom we should mention, his co-star on your show of shows, to a health food restaurant and looking stricken because he can't get one of his steaks. I asked Mimi, since food is so central to every culture, what's different about the Jewish relationship with food? I mean, for instance, why are Jews, Italians care every bit as much about food as Jews. What's the difference between Italians and Jews? And she says Italians are just like the Jews when it comes to food, but without the panic. And I thought that was a line that summarized it perfectly, because there's one of the themes in all of Caesar's stuff about food is panic about not getting enough of it, or somebody getting more than you, or
missing a meal.
Or missing a meal, or somebody getting it before you do, or not getting the right kind of it. And there's this element of panic that you're not going to get what you need.
What would you have asked Sid Caesar if you could have?
I think that I did interview him. I interviewed him twice early on, because he was he already looked decrepit.
But after all your research.
Well, after all my research, I think that I would have asked him more about what happened to him. I would have asked him more about his decline. I would have asked him more about his self-destructiveness. I would have asked him about his drinking and his pill popping. I would have asked him more about what he saw in other people's comedy that he had devised. I think that those are the kinds of things I would have asked him. I would have asked him to reflect more on his life. But you know, he was a difficult man to interview. He was not the most introspective man in the world. He didn't leave a lot of papers behind. And ultimately, he was opaque. I think that I got farther in understanding him than anybody ever did, except for maybe his wife and his kids. But ultimately, he was a difficult guy to figure out.
One of the things he said was that every gag that can possibly be told has already been told. What did he mean by that?
Well, I think that it was one way of distancing himself from conventional comedians. He wasn't doing the simple stuff, and he wasn't doing the one-liners, and he wasn't doing the wisecracks, and he wasn't doing the sort of topical stuff. He steered clear of anything political. That's an interesting issue in and of itself. I mean, you know, it was in the McCarthy era, and he felt that anything political was not only ephemeral, but it was dangerous. I mean, these were Jews. His writers were almost exclusively Jewish, and many of them had left-wing backgrounds, people like Carl Reiner and Mel Tolkien, who was his principal writer for many, many years. And so he tried to find insights into human beings that were durable and eternal. And it was not only sort of more of a challenge for a comedian to come up with these things, but it was safer in a way. And he was not one to take risks. I mean, he had to be very careful. He had to tread carefully, given the anti-Semitism and politics of the era. He wasn't a free agent.
And he said there's something funny in everything. David Denby in The New Yorker said David Margolick is an ideal cultural historian, curious and loving, but wary of nostalgia. The book is When Caesar Was King, How Sid Caesar Reinvented American Comedy. Thanks, David.
Sam, it's such a privilege to be on your show. Thank you.
That's it for this edition of Close Up for the New York Times and CUNY TV. I'm Sam Roberts. If you'd like to support more programs like this, please consider donating at the link on your screen. Thanks for watching.